and then that.
You were also there, so I want to begin first by thanking you all for your patience and your flexibility, and you'll correct me, I'm sure if I'm using this incorrectly, your charity even, in adjusting to our schedule. But those things also must be extended to Irene, who was very understanding of an important event that came up on campus. I also want to thank the many people who made Irene's visit in general and this lecture in particular possible, and that on a very compressed timeline. It was just over a month ago that Diane and I thought about inviting Irene to speak with her students, which she did this morning in their New Testament classes. I think what you speak about, Clement of Alexandria and Cyprian, you all spoke about Clement of Alexandria and Cyprian of Carthage. I wasn't able to attend that because I was teaching at the same time. But she also is speaking with us all now, and thanks, therefore, are clearly due to Diane for her initiative and enthusiasm, and also Diane designed these lovely posters that you've seen, hopefully, all around campus. I also want to thank Sharon Kirk for her wonderful help in arranging the visit and in talking to brand new Washington and Lee professors through the logistics of inviting a speaker to campus. So she was really wonderfully helpful. And ultimately, we must thank the Karas Fund of the Classics Department, the Roger Mudd Center of Ethics, and most generously, the Howerton Fund and the Religion Department for their financial support of Irene's visit. And finally, I want to express my thanks to Irene for making time for this visit. Irene is currently an assistant dean at the School of General Studies at Columbia University, where I think you're advising somewhere in the number of 250 students. So I'm amazed that she is still finding time to work on her own research, her own scholarship. But I guess I shouldn't be amazed, because here I'll offer just a little anecdote. When I first met Irene, I was a prospective graduate student at Columbia, and she was in Latin language survey course, and it was on Lucan, a very difficult poem. And at some point, someone asked a question, and the professor said, that's a really interesting question. Would anyone be interested in sort of doing a little presentation on that next class? And I see this hand shoot up, and I was like, who is that? And it was, sure enough, Irene, and that was really a lesson for me right as I was preparing to enter graduate school. That education is ultimately a self-driven process, and Irene sort of demonstrates that throughout. She's making time for her scholarship, even now when she's working very hard in a very different administrative job. But I'd also like to offer a little background on Irene's education. She's a scholar of social and economic history of late antiquity, and her classics chops are right up there with the best of them. Her Greek and Latin, excellent. She received her PhD, her MPhil, and her MA, all from Columbia, and her BA from Barnard College. Her dissertation is entitled Money, Power, Respect, Charity and the Creation of the Church. And see some overlap there. Her lecture today will offer an overview in parts and zoom in parts of that dissertation. Irene has received prestigious predoctoral fellowships from Dumbarton Oaks and the American Academy Rome. She was a Rome Prize recipient, and she has written on church, state, and family in late antiquity, among many other topics, and offered presentations on such topics as social history in the early church, domestic space, and Christian votive offerings. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Irene San Pietro as she speaks to us today about charity and the creation of the church.
Not sure I can live up to my legend, but thank you. That's an extremely generous introduction, and in the spirit that I've felt here at this university, just really huge warmth and generosity. And I just did a double take as I was on the plane yesterday and thought, how did I get here happen so quickly? But it's wonderful, and I had a great time speaking with everyone this morning, and I hope that you will enjoy this topic and hopefully learn something. So I am asking what makes charity interesting and why we should care about its history. We all know that charity it's doing the most good. It's things that you can write off on your taxes. It's a good thing. To be precise, along with faith and hope, it's one of 3 good things, according to St. Paul and Thomas Aquinas. And we should care, I think, because charity, in the old Latin sense of the term caritas, Christian love, wasn't always what we think of as charity, but once Christianity was decriminalized by Constantine in 313 and joined the club of religiones licitae, or legal religions, charity instead of martyrdom became what made a Christian a Christian. If this seems uncontroversial now, it's because we comfortably move between the Latin and Greek terminology, between agape and caritas. But the meaning of charity was, in fact, extremely controversial in late antiquity for several hundred years. And this is because the definition of charity was recognized to be something extremely important early in the history of Christianity, specifically because it offered the possibility of correlating right action and right belief. So you can think of this as a justification of pious showing off, meaning that charity created a set of behaviors, in effect, that marked a person out as a Christian without it collapsing into either empty ritual or other kinds of hypocrisy. And I intend the scare quotes. So in other words, you could be beautiful outwardly without being full of bones inwardly like the whitewashed tombs. Your public acts could testify to your inner virtue rather than making you a hypocrite by definition. So as the specter of hypocrisy implies, the definition of charity had positive and negative aspects. The Christian in late antiquity was always and inevitably 2 things. First, a believer, and second, and as important, not a pagan, a Jew, a philosopher, or a civic patron. From this perspective, it was never enough merely to be generous. This was merely to be a philanthropist. Nor was it enough to just give alms, because this is something that pagans and Jews already did. It wasn't unique. One had to both do and be the right things to qualify as properly Christian. So this dual criterion of virtue, this feedback between mind states and actions, came out of the ways that early Christians responded to several critiques that they faced early in their history. First, they faced the critique that theirs was merely a national or an ethnic religion like Judaism, but without the pedigree of antiquity. Secondly, that Christianity was a travesty of philosophy. And third, that the Trinity collapsed their supposed monotheism right back into polytheism. In order not to be absorbed into existing ideals, Christian theologians put immense weight on the uniqueness of Christian virtue. And the Holy Grail in terms of framing the Christian understanding of virtue was to find something, some concept, that would testify that the Christian was a Christian and not anything else while they were doing it. So virtue had to be active because it had to separate out its practitioners. But this precipitates massive theological problems, since the basic moral difference that Christians maintained was the privacy or secrecy of virtue, not letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing. So in this talk, we'll first look at negative definitions of charity, that is, what charity was not in its formative period, and then we'll look at a positive definition of charity. In fact, what charity is the wrong question. Charity was understood through a series of moral exemplars, so it's more useful to ask who displayed charity and who did or could not. Saints and biblical figures were paradigms of best practice, for sure, but non-Christian culture heroes had to fail. The biblical widow, for example, represented an idealized poor person. According to Cyprian of Carthage, and some of you will be familiar with this from the morning, she still found a way of doing good even amidst the difficulties and straits of poverty. She cast in her 2 mites, which were all that she had, into the treasury. John Chrysostom used the same example of the widow to teach his congregation that it's the intention that's considered, not the amount of the gift. So she gave a little when others gave a lot, but she contributed not less than they because she gave a lot in proportion to her situation. So rather than excusing anyone from good works, the lesson we're meant to draw is that God cognizes or recognizes our intentions, and that makes giving an imperative for everyone. It universalizes the imperative to charity. Bishops like Cyprian and Chrysostom conveyed the message that alms were what the widow gave and not what the Pharisees, Jews, philosophers, and patrons gave. And why not? Well, the antitypes of charity always fall into some error that nullifies their generosity. In thinking through what that error is or has to be, the Christian theologians clarified the obligations of Christians and began to think of charity as something always somehow fuller and more complete than the various types of generosity, something more like the whole of virtue, so it's universalized even further. I'm going to focus on the philosophers who were singled out as defective in critical ways. So, Crates of Melis lived in the 2nd century BC, Antisthenes the Cynic in 4th century, and Simon of Athens in 5th century BC. All of them appeared in the Roman philosophical pantheon, and they were treated by the likes of Strabo, Diogenes Laertius, and Plutarch as moral exemplars. They famously renounced or distributed their wealth, and in the Christian tradition, these acts of rejection somehow show them up as hypocrites because they lack the correct motivation to act. So we're meant to understand that without faith, their seemingly good acts are superficial and can't be taken as a necessary index of goodness. So Lactantius gives us the case of Simon. And he says, "But let us suppose that it is possible that anyone, by natural and innate goodness, should gain true virtues. Such a man as we have heard that Simon was at Athens, who both gave alms to the needy and entertained the poor, clothed and naked. Yet that one thing which is of greatest importance is wanting, the acknowledgement of God. Then all those good things are superfluous and empty, and in pursuing them he has labored in vain." Lactantius gives Simon some credit by acknowledging that his gifts were in fact alms and not, say, bribes. But he faults him for his lack of faith. Is that fair? Well, he's not the only one that does it. Jerome does it too. And he's explicit that the lack of faith was the key failure of the philosophers. He says, he actually doesn't say heathens. Antisthenes and Crates the Theban have done as much before now, but to offer oneself to God, that is the mark of Christians and apostles. So, like the rich man of the parable, public figures like philosophers and patrons fail because their otherwise good actions are not accompanied by the correct state of the soul. This is a very interesting argument for several reasons, I think. Firstly, because it credits the philosophers with professional levels of competency, so the philosophers get to be philosophers. They should have been able to infer Christianity even before the incarnation by deriving God from the good. They should have been able to get faith from wisdom, and to the extent that they didn't, they're bad philosophers. Secondly, Christian writers could not actually deny the moral force of pagan exemplars. So Jerome actually uses Crates the Theban, millionaire of days gone by, and says that he was on his way to Athens to study philosophy. He cast away untold gold in the belief that wealth could not be compatible with virtue. What a contrast he offers us, the disciples of a poor Christ, who cram our pockets with gold and cling under pretext of almsgiving to our old riches. So he gets to have it both ways. But he can't actually deny that there's some force to these great renunciations, and they're not always sure how to appropriate them. So the Christian theologians draw a distinction, that the philosophers have an apparent form of virtue, but not real virtue. They are outwardly good, but inwardly somehow no better than the whitewashed tombs. What Lactantius and Jerome denied was that the philosophers' actions was that someone's actions could be good if they were not Christians. And I've wondered, is this tautologous, that only a Christian can do good because only Christians can do good? And I actually think not, because of that standard of inference. As long as conversion has a rational component, that is, because orthodoxy can be deduced or induced from existing ideas, virtue is still available to everyone, because anyone can reason themselves into believing correctly. What this excludes unequivocally, however, is one of the key features of ancient Mediterranean society, and that's public display. That's renunciation or benefaction, these very public acts of patronage that were, the bread and butter of Mediterranean public society. So whatever other obstacles they might face, Christians who heard about these exemplars were meant to understand that they had the invaluable benefit of starting from a position of correct belief, which is the origin of good works. They did not have to become philosophers themselves and do the hard work of reason like everyone before the Incarnation, yet there were still very many ways for Christians to fail at virtue because they could easily fall away from the correct mindset. Clement of Alexandria's warning on pride is representative. He writes, "If you do alms, let no one know it. If you fast, anoint yourself, that God may know and not a single human being." So don't look ragged while you're fasting. For Clement, the Christian was the opposite of the philosopher in that sense, or the patron. These people worked in public and accumulated either students or clients. Christians, by definition, did their good works in secret. And as Tertullian lamented, for this reason they were both the best citizens and the most blamed. The requirements of the right state of mind turn the example of philosophic liberality on its head, really. The spectacular liquidations of personal wealth that had been praised become merely conspicuous consumptions. And the Christian is asked not to renounce everything at once, but to measure it out bit by bit. And this is a potentially perverse understanding of Christian duty, again, as we talked about in class this morning, because it means that the Christian, in order not to be an exhibitionist, in order not to be a patron, should trickle rather than pour out his wealth. Christians might have to remain wealthy in order to be properly pious. Why? Well, Clement of Alexandria, in Who is the Rich Man Who Shall Be Saved, tells us that riches which benefit our neighbors are not to be thrown away. Instead, they should be treated as instruments which are good for those who know the instrument and bad for those who don't know the instrument. So just as you would not throw away your sword in a war, but you would keep it to inflict many cuts on your enemy, the Christian who disdains money and honors God may still have to be intimate with wealth in order to do alms properly, in order to accomplish the Christian moral mandate. If Christians have to have a rational relation to wealth in order to avoid the fate of philosophers and patrons, then Christians will potentially have to be wealthy, which is problematic. In response, Clement assures us that the specific good deeds that Jesus required actually requires wealth. He so praised the use of property as to enjoin, along with its addition, giving a share of it, to give a drink to the thirsty, bread to the hungry, to take the houseless in, to clothe the naked. So you need to have a house to take the homeless in, you need clothing to clothe the naked, you need water, you need the things in order to give them. For Clement, the renunciation of wealth, on the other hand, if you just get rid of the things immediately, that can be as emotional as hanging on to it. And both can be symptoms of culpable attention-seeking. They can both be strategies of magnifying yourself. Salvation is the opposite of that. It's a rational, passionless state, which he calls the privilege of pure and passionless souls. So in a way, it becomes the Stoic ideal. Christians were meant to understand that Simon, Crates, and Antisthenes, the great philosophic renouncers, what they did were acts of passion, and that they undermined their credentials as philosophers. The true believer, on the other hand, will relate to wealth wisely and dispose of it prudently, and that might mean keeping it, which in turn might explain why some Christians are wealthy, why there's not some sort of automatic equalizing effect. So because of the theological emphasis on the process of relating to wealth, the heroes of philosophical renunciation who had been models of asceticism, become its villains. The philosophers fail to have the correct mindset when they're giving. They also fail to give alms to its legitimate objects, who are the worthy poor. According to Clement, the combination is a perfect storm of vice. Nor was the renunciation of wealth and the bestowment of it on the poor or needy a new thing, for many did so before the Saviour's advent, some because of leisure, thereby obtained for learning, and on account of a dead wisdom, and others for empty fame and vain glory, the Anaxagoras, Democriti, and Cratises. It's worth noting, by the way, that Diogenes Laertius, in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, in fact gives conflicting accounts of what Crates did with his wealth. Either he threw it into the sea, so just threw it away, or he converted it to coin and he distributed it among the poor, or he left it with a banker for his children. So you can choose your own adventure on this one. The homilists tend to prefer the most dissolute possible variant because it offers the best foil. Christian holy men have to be the counterexamples of the philosophers. And hagiography includes a wealth of examples in which Christian holy men correct the examples of the philosophers, correct their deficiencies. So Athanasius' Life of Anthony, for example, which became an instant classic in the 4th century, describes how the young Anthony gives his property to the poor of his village after hearing a sermon on the parable of the camel. Jerome wrote his Life of Paul to compete with that story, and he claims that, well, in fact, Paul was the first hermit, and that he was orphaned, and he also gave up a rich inheritance. But the ideal remains the same. There are also examples of holy women. So Pseudo-Athanasius' 5th century life of the desert mother Syncletica imagines that she sold everything and renounced her possessions, distributing them among the poor. Finally, in Mark the Deacon's Life of Porphyry of Gaza, the future bishop, he's working in Jerusalem as a bricklayer when he gets word that he has an inheritance, so he can go home and be rich. But in fact, he refuses to accept it, and he sends an agent to claim it for him and dispense it among the poor, so that he can continue laying bricks in Jerusalem, where his piety is eventually recognized and he's promoted to bishop. It's important, I think, that Porphyry took no interest in the dispensation itself. In fact, these Christian holy people have a completely apathetic relationship to wealth, and Porphyry leaves the dispensation of it to a third party. He won't even touch it. So the implied comparison is with amicitia and clientela, the institutions of patronage, which involved a face-to-face relation, which involved condescension. So as long as there's some sort of beneficiary, there's a debt relation, and this is what the holy men seem to object to. They refuse. There's no condescension because there's no facing of the beneficiaries, and so there's no grounds for an obligation. Nobody is indebted by charity. It's the free gift. So without condescension, Porphyry, he doesn't condescend, but he doesn't refuse to give either. And so this contributes the definition of charity against the definition of patronage. It's supposed to be all of the good things, but none of the bad things. What's really interesting is that we see that the philosopher is assimilated to the figure of the patron. And it really drives home for me that charity confronts a contradiction in the universalization of Christianity. Virtue has to be private, but it must also mark the Christian reliably. Non-Christians will lack the reciprocity between belief and practice, and so their generosity doesn't qualify as charity. Christians have to beware of backsliding into the traditional social roles, and they can do this through pride or laxity. They have to avoid both. So in short, it's not enough to repudiate or distribute wealth, but whatever good is done, it has to be done in a way that reliably conjoins the act with the correct belief. So this brings me to the second portion of my talk. Charity is the framework within which believers can register that coincidence. It's the framework within orthopraxy, correct action, registers orthodoxy, correct belief. And theologians formulated and reformulated this concept, which is what I was referring to in the talk abstract where I said it's invented. It's combined and recombined because theologians are searching for a way for action and belief to reliably correspond and not to indicate anything else. So they swap out the content over and over again, and so I wanted to give you some examples. We have Chrysostom, and I've actually bolded the wrong part of his quote, but here you see that almsgiving, he says, it's not sufficient. If you fast every day, so did the virgins, and it availed them nothing. Prayer is not enough on its own. It's unfruitful. Without almsgiving, everything is unclean and unprofitable. So he conjoins prayer and almsgiving. Now, he tries that one out. The Kephaliah, which is actually not an Orthodox Christian text, but a Manichaean text, but it was just too rich to refuse, has fasting, prayer, and alms. And then Augustine has the same fasting, prayer, and alms. Now that raises another problem, because how do you distinguish the Christians from the Manichaeans? But bracket that. And I include Tobit because you have this Old Testament prototype. And so basically what you see a lot of theologians experimenting with are combinations of fasting, prayer, alms, humility, sacrifice. Which of these things, additionally will equal charity, which equals good, which equals virtue? It's not an easy thing to argue. But fasting, prayer, and alms were the ones that were most frequently referred to together as the complete package of virtue, which is charity. Maybe because of their Old Testament pedigree, maybe because of the triad of fasting, prayer, and sacrifice, which you get in Tobit. But as Augustine preached, virtue, and he tells us that virtue is equivalent to charity because, quote, it's by charity that other things come to be rightly loved. So it's the superordinate love. All other loves are derivative. It's the form of love, if you will. And bishops advertised charity repeatedly in their homilies. They stressed that donations had to be given in the right way, at the right times, to the right people, and they created concrete administrative systems to support the accomplishment of charity so that offertory, or alms, they funded hospitals, hostels, dispensaries. They did a fair amount of good, but this had to be done in a controlled context. So I just want to look at some of the earliest writings to show you how much this administrative intervention changes what charity is and helps to define it. The earliest writings on fasting show us the moment before the episcopal systems were consolidated. The Shepherd of Hermas was a 1st or 2nd century text. It was never canonical, but it was considered instructive, and it was widely read. In it, we have a divine good shepherd who's instructing a Christian, Hermas, on the proper way to fast. And the shepherd Hermas says, while fasting and sitting on a certain mountain and giving thanks to the Lord for his dealings with me, I see a shepherd sitting down beside me. You do not know, he says. So this is how he starts the conversation. Like, by the way, you don't know how to fast unto the Lord. This useless fasting which you observe has no value. But I will teach you what is a full and acceptable fasting to the Lord. Offer to God a fasting of the following kind. Do no evil in your life, and serve the Lord with a pure heart. Keep his commandments, walking in his precepts, and let no evil desire arise in your heart. And believe in God. If you do these things, you will keep a great fast, and one acceptable to God. Now this should strike you as strange. We can see that mindset and behavior do already correspond in this text. And they can do so unproblematically because here we have a divine figure who steps in to offer a God's eye view. So you're doing no evil, and the shepherd is kind of guaranteeing this. And as long as there's the coincidence between the mind state and the action, then the fast is kept. I think that this episode can be interpreted in two ways. One interpretation sees fasting as a matter of conscience. It's private, it's outside of institutions. But a second option is to read the episode as requiring a proxy or a vicarious God's eye view. And the clergy argue this second interpretation. Bishops embraced this option, and they offered themselves as expert human observers that were able to represent the God's eye view. Their involvement changed the nature of the virtuous acts. Fasting and alms become not only the visible consequences of a correct orientation in faith, it's not just something that comes out of having the right intention, but they become discrete episodes of donation, the merit of which can be accumulated. And as importantly, good works become something that now had to be done within the context of the church. And this is because the amateur almsgiver risked losing his soul. And in case you're skeptical that the bishops actually take on this role, just to give you as an example, Augustine argues that bishops should be these guarantors explicitly. He says that bishops save Christians from dangerous temptations of pride, and the condition of our race would have been much more degraded if God had not chosen to make use of men as ministers of his word to their fellow men. So for Augustine, episcopal surveillance is in one sense, it's a best case scenario. It's an unfortunate symptom of the fact that we're fallen, but it's really the best that we can get. We have these proxy God's eye viewers. I think that this raises the stakes theologically, and it's really decisive for the transformation of love into the acts, attitudes, and institutional structures of charity. It provides a really specific kind of institutional mandate. This is not to say that the terminology of love ever dropped out of the patristic lexicon. It doesn't. But over the course of late antiquity, patristic writers increasingly define correct love in terms of charity, meaning fasting, prayer, and alms. So Cyprian tells us that our prayers and fastings are of less avail unless they're aided by almsgiving, unless they be made sufficient by the addition of deeds and good works. So each part of the equation is necessary, but only together are they sufficient. None of them individually suffice. This doesn't mean that each variable has equal status, that fasting and prayer and alms are all equally valuable. And different writers had different opinions and they debated a lot. So for example, Pseudo-Clement says that fasting is better than prayer and almsgiving is better than both. People go back and forth about it. For Chrysostom, not only were alms better, but they were best given in cash. Honor him with this honor, spending thy wealth on poor people. I say this not forbidding such offerings, but requiring you together with them and before them to give alms. Destitution was no excuse. You could never be too poor to be charitable, which kind of begs the question of who are the beneficiaries of this, but that's a different inquiry. Nevertheless, destitution is no excuse, and Chrysostom tells us almsgiving especially needs money, but it shines forth in greater degree through poverty, as in the case of the widow. Augustine concurred. And I love Augustine and Chrysostom because, as I was telling Diane, there are chatty Cathys, and they just say exactly what you need them to say. So Augustine tells us that cash is best, but when it falls short, an offering in kind will do. And everyone is expected to be a giver because everyone is expected to be striving for virtue. So he says, if charity is destitute of means, so that it cannot find what to bestow upon the poor, let it love. Let it give 1 cup of cold water, and as much shall be laid to his account as to Zacchaeus, who gave half his patrimony to the poor. So to me, these are some of the examples that imply, if not a formal collective project of charity, at least a widespread preoccupation on the part of bishops with advertising charity to lay Christians and instructing them in the fundamentals of donation. By the 5th century, Christian theologians had a working definition of charity, so it starts to stabilize. It was neither alms nor fasting nor prayer alone, but all of these things in the proper order. That is, alms from fasting, rendered prayerfully by way of the poor to the clergy. Very tight system. Only this combination of actions merited salvation, and the bishops were able to enforce this in place of other conceptions of virtue. To see what a change in sensibility this represents, we only really need to compare the Shepherd of Hermas to Pseudo-Athanasius' commentary on it. And so I'll compare just very briefly to conclude a late 1st, 2nd century text with a 6th, 7th century commentary on the text. Now in the original, the pious Christian is left alone to discern how to best behave virtuously. The shepherd advises Hermas, be on guard against every evil word, every evil desire, and purify your heart from the vanities of this world. If you guard against these things, your fasting will be perfect. And then he goes on to describe various desirable mind states, humility of mind, and he who has received the benefit of your humility will fill his own soul, etc., etc. In this text, in the earlier text, the shepherd is advising Hermas to let his own pure heart guide him in deciding whatever to do and whatever is good to avoid. So fasting is just one consequence of a faithful way of moving in the world. So Hermas is urged in the same vision, later in the vision, not to get too hung up on the mechanics of fasting. In short, not to make it a ritual. By the 7th century, the commentator has a rather different perspective. I would think that he actually reverses the order of priority. So he says, be on guard to fast from every evil word and evil report, and purify your heart from every defilement and revenge and base covetousness. Now, there's a gap. He omits a sentence and goes on, and on the day you fast, be content with bread, herbs, and water, giving thanks to God. Further down, your sacrifice will be acceptable before the Lord and inscribed in the heavens on the day of requital. By omitting the second sentence, which I've marked out for you, the shepherd, the commentator reverses the moral of the text. In the original, the shepherd evokes Isaiah's criticism of empty ritual sacrifices when he says to Hermas, you do not know how to fast. It is a useless fasting which you observe and has no value. And the first thing that he actually says is be on your guard, purify your heart. And he's actually requiring negative actions, not to do things, but to be certain things. Fasting is just one consequence. It's not actually the thing that's being trained. So the 1st century text, I think, is pretty clear that fasting is a consequence, but you're training the mind state. The 7th century commentator, on the other hand, by omitting the second sentence, and the second sentence says that if you guard against these things, your fasting will be perfect. He omits that. And so he places the weight of virtue on the ritual of the fast instead. In doing so, he shifts the force of the moral imperative from cultivating states of mind to recommending specific actions that constitutes piety, calls these acts sacrifices. Where the source text derives behaviors from psychological states, the commentator builds up righteousness out of a particular collection of acts. This shift, I think, shows clearly that the definition of charity began to codify moral behavior under a certain kind of surveillance, clerical surveillance. And in the context of the church, the bishops were able to offer a God's eye view that the shepherd provides Hermas within the text. But that actually means that the priority is on what's observable, which is the ritual action. You can't observe the interior of a person. So to sum up, this has been very, very brief. In earliest Christianity, almsgiving was not so different from what the Jews, pagans, philosophers, and patrons did, and that caused some anxiety. It was originally a pious act alms were originally a pious act that was sufficient on its own, but by the 2nd century, patristic writers were beginning to differentiate Christian virtue from the ambient culture, and they did this by breaking down its face-to-face aspect. Charity complicated almsgiving and offered an interpretation of the imperative to love that justified the regulation of alms as a protection from the morally corrupting forces of patronage. Because alms were considered the material traces of virtue, the regulation of almsgiving was of great interest to late antique bishops. Charity required appropriate means, motivations, and objects, without which neither alms nor fasting nor prayer could be virtuous on their own, but only in circumstances that are stipulated and monitored by the bishops. So charity subjected virtue to the expertise of clergy and donation to the authority of bishops. Charity made correct belief and right actions reciprocal, so that only a restricted set of good works, fasting, prayer, and alms, could be taken as evidence, reliable evidence of faith. This is rather different from our view today. We view charity as an entirely gratuitous act, or I'll speak for myself. We don't give to every beggar just because we give to one. We tend not to think about it after we've done it, or at least I was definitely channeling my experience on the New York City subway. So you size a person up and it's kind of impulsive. By contrast, in late antiquity, charity was in complete earnest, at least from the perspective of the theologians, because it offered the possibility of an act identifying the practitioner as a Christian in a way that nothing else could. This is not to say that Christians really had tunnel vision about what was good and what was worth doing, but in terms of marking out what a Christian was. Charity was a technology that offered tools that other conceptions of virtue didn't offer up until that point. But that also meant that the failure to engage in charity was punishable because it reliably implied heterodoxy, not believing the right things because you're not doing the right things. So what we start to see is a moral regime of charity that enforces symmetry of belief and practice, and it made that symmetry contingent upon the laity's participation in the institutions of the church as supervised by the bishops. Failure to participate in the communal practices of the church, including over time the calendar of feasts and fasts, because the liturgical calendar indexed when you're supposed to fast, and when you're supposed to fast, you generate alms, and then you render them into the collection box. Failure to participate in the liturgical calendar suggested a failure of belief wholesale, and that merited sanction. As Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria and the city's representative to the Council of Nicaea in 321 wrote, two very bad things. I love that opening. Two very bad things are ill will and unbelief, both of which are contrary to righteousness. For ill will is opposed to charity and unbelief to faith, just in the same way as bitterness is opposed to sweetness, darkness to light, evil to good, death to life, falsehood to truth. Those, therefore, who abound in these vices that are repugnant to virtue are in a manner dead. For those malignant and unbelieving hate charity and faith, and they who do this are the enemies of God. Thank you.
Thanks, I bet you'll take some questions, or
I would love
open it
to
up
take some questions.
I have a question about the actual social background of these things. We have read, one comment pagans made was, see how these Christians love one another. And apparently there was some genuine evidence of that in more than one place in a long period of time. And then it did get more organized, which is very understandable. But how much responsibility would a typical bishop, not the bishop of Rome, but the bishop of Alexandria, but an ordinary small city bishop have to face? How many poor we have to feed clothing from these donations?
Yeah, and I spent some time with this evidence. There are about 20 inventories that are extant, papyrus inventories and manuscript inventories, and some of them actually seem to give evidence of shrines where goods were being dispensed, and there are records of transactions involving perishable goods like clothing. It's really hard to quantify it. I've actually tried to quantify it for the large cities from numbers that Chrysostom gives us and we get from papal dispensaries in Rome. And this number is going to come out of nowhere, so I hate to say it, but in the big cities, I've seen that they've been able to help maybe 1 to 2% of the population that was living there at the time. And I would be happy to give you the specifics like by email. But I've really struggled with this question because there's a lot of impressionistic evidence. When Pachomius first goes into the desert, he gives dates from his personal tree to passersby. You get a lot of details in hagiography, but you don't get orders of magnitude. And if you try to do orders of magnitude, you're usually working off of Episcopal rhetoric where someone like Chrysostom is saying, we need more money because we can't help enough people, and if 10 people gave what one person gave, we would have no poor people. And if you try to extrapolate numbers, you can definitely get an order of magnitude like 1 to 2%. But you can't actually answer the question that you want to answer, which is, did the church do the most good? Were they actually trying to provide a social safety net? Were they trying to secure social justice? Were they cognizant of the poor? Were they tokenizing? That's not a question that I'm comfortable. I wouldn't stake my life on it. But.
Yeah, going off of that was what I was curious about. I know you probably aren't comfortable speaking on it, but do you have any idea based on papyrus scripts that you've seen, like where these transactions are going specifically, what percentage? I'm saying how much social justice was being actually done. Yeah. Well, there's a qualitative argument and a quantitative argument to be made, and the qualitative argument is that by recognizing the category of people who were the destitute poor,
it was 100% better than not recognizing that category. So there's a number. but on the other hand, there are a lot of people who argue, like Claire Sotinel, that the church did not make an appreciable difference to the structural poverty that was being experienced in late antiquity. And there's a volume on that called, it's by Atkins and Osborne, called Poverty in Late Antiquity. Anyway, it's edited by Atkins and Osborne. So there's a collection of, there's people who've been trying to figure out, did the church make a dent in poverty or not? I think it's still an open question. I mean, there were definitely more kinds of institutions. You get evidence of hospitals, hostels, soup kitchens, prison visiting. So there was outreach. There was definitely organized outreach. And those are things that would be worth investigating. As far as how effective that outreach was, like I said, some is better than none, but who knows how much.
There was a lot of discussion of what counted. So, was charity ever refused?
Was charity ever refused?
For lack of genuineness, for lack of love, for
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Chrysostom has a homily on this, where he talks about how the church is forced to truck and barter because people are not being generous enough, and is forced to accept the gifts of people who are really unworthy to give them, who don't have the right state of prayerfulness. But nevertheless, it's the lesser of evil not to serve the poor with tainted money, with dirty money, than to not accept it. So, but then again, that's in the context of a solicitation. So, was it ever refused? I just want to say one. Okay, there was an economy of letters of recommendation, and this picked out people who were officially the worthy poor. So you could maybe infer from that if you didn't have the letter, then maybe you weren't licensed, you weren't admitted to certain institutions. That the more formal these systems became more exclusive. Also, the order of widows, the ministry to destitute widows, was something that gradually became more organized and became something more like nuns. And whenever you get these sort of licensed moments of certification, then you have a group that's symbolically significant and publicly displayed, and you're no longer treating the social phenomenon. So that happens with a couple of populations.
I just wanted to add an example. Marcion, they gave back his money at the election of 140 because he donated all his money to the church, and then they declared him a heretic, and then
They gave him back?
They gave back. There's a whole big to-do.
That's a great example.
This might be silly to ask, but where the something like the brain don't involved in this. Because obviously they don't have the right state of mind because they're pagans, but I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as something an explicit act of giving to get attention. But would be seen as bribery in some way.
Two things. Rhetorically, it's constructed as a conspicuous consumption, and it's something that if you do it for and it's in public now, then you've gotten your reward now in terms of the institution of patronage, of clientage. And so Christian dispensation is supposed to be something different. It's something that is supposed to be done furtively. Or it's supposed to be something that you don't do personally, and so you hand it off to somebody else, and so it's effectively secret because there's a third party who's doing it for you. Now, that's a really interesting point that you bring up with the grain dole, because depending on your view of the third century crisis and the monetary reforms of late antiquity, there may or may not have been a lot of institutions left standing. But the infrastructure was there, and in fact, a lot of the diaconia distribution points for charity in the city of Rome exactly replicate the sites of the grain dole. So they're just taken over and then staffed by deacons. And if you're interested in that, Robert Coates Stevens of British Academy of Rome has written that.
Were there institutions founded, as there have been some in more recent centuries, where someone would say, all right, here's my home, I'll transform it into an orphanage or a hospital for pilgrims or whatever, a home for the dying or something, and maintain it some note of the charity of one particular person?
Yes, yes. In fact, probably the most famous example is Olympias in Constantinople, who had some sort of working foundation in her own mansion, her own townhouse in Constantinople. And this was something that was controversial because it was not integrated into the diocesan structure of the church and the disciplinary canons of the later church councils, and with the support of the later law codes and Justinianic code, the Novellae of Justinian gradually try to incorporate these foundations into physical structures. So there are these like 30-year clauses where if a church, a bishop can basically homestead a private institution integrated into his diocese. So there was definitely some power struggles around private foundations.
But the foundations did exist.
Yes, yeah, and they continue to exist into the medieval period.
Yeah, I know some of that.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the visibility of donating to the church, because it seems like a great answer if you don't want to be conspicuously donating. Just give it to the church secretly and they'll make sure it gets to a good place. But do people actually talk about the church as a mode of making that secrecy happen?
Yes. Tertullian is a really early example. He talks about a box of the church. There are instances, there's a lot of talk about boxes and bags and chests of the church. And so there are these collection points. There have also been some found, there's a church in Sicily that was recently excavated that might have an offering box under a wall collapse. So there's not only textual reference, but possibly physical sites in a couple of places.
So I want to go back to the comparison to patronage, Rome, and Amicitia and friendship. And thinking, I guess this question sort of falls outside of the scope of your talk just because it falls right after it. Thinking of charity in a temporal sequence. So patronage came with an obligation to sort of pay back indefinitely what you had been given. Does charity come with any such obligation?
That's where prayer comes in. The church are obligated to pray for you. And they're called the altars of God. And so if you are somehow too destitute to give, and we've seen that arguably nobody is, but if you in fact are for whatever reason, you are obliged to, in a way, be the client of the person that has benefited you. You're not directly the client because there's a third-party intermediary that's preventing you from being condescended to. So you don't know. It's like firing squad. You don't know who did it. But you have to render prayer for all of the benefactors. And this comes up in liturgy, in hymns. There are these set moments of acclamation during masses where people get to pray for they're supposed to do it publicly and private, the benefactors, but as a group.
And does that layer onto the idea of gratitude to God? You know, we saw in some of the passages, give thanks to God. Is that part of the act of prayer?
That's something I'm still struggling with because there are hugely mixed metaphors for what God is. He's both a debtor and a lender. He gives the resources correctly, but you can also lend to God, buy space in heaven. I mean, it's totally mixed. And what appropriate gratitude is, I mean, that language is there, but it doesn't change the nature of the formula, which is to. So the way that the fast really, if you're wealthy, you don't have to fast, but fasting makes it possible for people who are not traditionally patrons to generate funds they wouldn't have had. And this is something you still see in churches today with 24-hour fast. You save the money you would have spent on food. And so you actually cut into subsistence in order to create disposable income. And then you give that to the intermediary, and it's dispensed according to their expert opinion, which is better than yours, and which is unbiased, and which allows you not to be a patron. And then they pray, and that's how intercession happens. So there's an indirect. It's like that.
I guess it's kind of going off that, but like we were talking earlier about like the widow giving away everything she does. So is that still the right thing to do then? Like not take care?
That depends on how you define subsistence, and this is something that theologians debate about for hundreds of years. what are you entitled to? Some people think you're entitled to dry eating, which is bread and water. Some people think you're entitled to be vegetarian. Some people think you're entitled to a little bit of meat, and they go back and forth.
May I ask? I'm really intrigued by this idea of how one induces oneself into right belief before the incarnation.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you, like, does right belief include the Trinity?
Probably the best source for that is City of God. And Augustine has several pages where he's like, well, he basically really wants to appropriate Plato. He was such a smart guy, he should have been able to figure it out. Does it include the Trinity? I mean, he says it should have definitely included the deity, the Godhead. He should have been able to get to monotheism. Should he have been able to get to this historical Christ? Should he have been able to get to the triune God? Not necessarily, but definitely monotheism. And not henotheism, not preference for God, but true monotheism.
Well, if there are no more questions, can we thank Irene one more time? Well, thanks again to the financial sponsors.
Thank you for having me. And if any New Testament students have questions that they wrote down, they're staff ask. And or you can have email them. Oh, right, I have to do the thing. Next